Hi and welcome back. This week we're going to talk about drop shadows. Now, although the topic might sound a bit odd to you and you might be familiar with the drop shadow layer style, I encourage you to follow along because I'm not only going to cover how to use the drop shadow layer style and make that work a little bit better for you, but I'm also going to talk about when the layer style won't work and how to create your own drop shadows. And finally, I'll touch on some artistic concepts and theory of drop shadows so you can actually begin to understand how they really work and actually put Photoshop to work for you instead of being at the mercy of it. So let's follow along here. Perfect place for the drop shadow layer style are buttons. That's one place where the drop shadow works well. So I'm going to add a drop shadow to this button. If you followed along last week, let me move the window over a bit. If you followed along last week, you learned that you can use your cursor in the window to maneuver the drop shadow around instead of being at the mercy of the actual drop shadow dialog box. So let's say I want to add a default drop shadow, increase the opacity a bit, and that works great for a button. Also, let's say I want the button to appear higher. Well, as it begins to get higher off of the surface, it's going to decrease in opacity. The size of the drop shadow is actually going to spread out a bit and it's going to start to begin to get blurred. So we can recreate that effect here. And if I want to really bring it up off of the background, I can even increase the size more and decrease the opacity a little bit more. That really begins to bring it off the background and make it look like it's raised. Okay, so that's an example where the drop shadow layer style works great. Now let's look at one where it doesn't. Type. Type is a perfect place where the drop shadow doesn't always work the way you wanted it to. I don't really want to give this type a 3D look and add its default drop shadow like this. Now that looks okay and it brings the text out for me, but that's not quite the effect that I'm looking for. I want the type to appear as if it's situated on a surface and it's raised off of that surface. So you can say, if I start to begin to bring this down here, well, this isn't really giving me the effect that I want because as I spread it out, it gets too wide and I begin to lose the drop shadow altogether. And all it really does is just create a copy of that text, and that's not exactly what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a thinner drop shadow here. So I can decrease the opacity again. It's not really working for me. So let me cancel that, delete the drop shadow, and show you an example of how to create one for it. I usually choose to select the rounded rectangle tool out of the shape tools, and I'll select the fill pixels option and set your foreground color to black. Create a new layer and just draw a very thin black rectangle here. Choose filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and just experiment with the opacity a bit. Now this begins to give me a little bit more of what I want. If I want it to appear as if it's a dark drop shadow, I can leave the radius down. If I want it to appear a little bit lighter, I can add it up. After that, I can always increase or decrease the opacity. If I want to raise it even further, I can pull it down and I can choose filter, blur, Gaussian blur again, and I can just blur it some more. So very powerful way to create drop shadows. In this example, I just want it to appear as if it's right on top of a surface here. You see I have a reflection here. So I actually created a reflection for this one too. Just to appear as if it's right on the surface but just has a slight shadow to it. So hope you enjoyed this tip. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at extremephotoshop@yahoo.com and have a great weekend. Thanks.